Hey YouTube, today I'll be making another response to ToddAllenGates. Originally we've been talking about the problem of evil, and recently our conversation has branched out into the problem of suffering, in particular, the problem of animal suffering. So let's get started. Now I find it interesting that before he starts, he hedges a bit. So let's see what he has to say.
We can't use any argument to absolutely disprove the Christian notion of God, just as we can't absolutely disprove what Islam tells us about Allah, or what the Aztecs told us about the gods that demanded human sacrifice. And we can't even absolutely disprove the invisible pink unicorn.
Now I actually completely disagree here. It would be possible to show that God cannot exist. In fact, that's exactly what the logical problem of evil attempts to do. If you can show something as logically contradictory, then you've effectively shown it doesn't exist. For example, there are no married bachelors in the world. And there's also no square circles or colored colorless objects, something which logically contradictory doesn't exist. Now, ironically, he includes the invisible pink unicorn as the example of something which he thinks cannot be logically disproven. But invisible refers to something which does not reflect color or not reflect light, and pink refers to something which does reflect light. That makes the invisible pink unicorn effectively the contradictory colored colorless object. So in essence, the invisible pink unicorn violates the second law of logic and therefore is logically contradictory. Now in the same way, if you could prove something about God's nature is logically contradictory, then you could have shown that God doesn't exist as well.
All we can do is say that there's no evidence to believe in any of these supernatural claims, and we can use logic and evidence to show why such claims are highly improbable.
Now he says that there's no evidence to believe in any supernatural claims. And I think there's good evidence to believe in the Christian God. In fact, that's one of the reasons I'm actually here on YouTube, is to provide that evidence. This video is merely a rebuttal to the problem of animal suffering, but I've made videos in the past where I attempt to provide evidence for God's existence, and I plan on making some videos for that in the future. And that being said, there are two ways to argue against God's existence. You can attempt to show that God's existence is actually impossible or merely improbable. And I'll point out why I think the problem of animal suffering fails to show either of those conclusions.
It also asks questions like, why did our loving Master Creator design life to prey upon life, and often in gruesome ways?
So there's the problem of animal suffering in a nutshell. Why does God create a world which has animal suffering and predation in it? It basically argues that God is not justified in creating a world where gazelles get eaten, or earthquakes happen, or puppies get crushed by boulders, or wasps kill caterpillars in grotesque ways. But I argue that this is not the kind of world that God created. Now for the young earth creationists, the answer for this is easy. God created Eden, which didn't have any suffering, death, earthquakes, anything like that. But there seems to be good evidence that suffering and death existed prior to humanity. So that's where theistic evolution comes into play. And I'll show one possible example of theistic evolution, one I thought I'd come up with my own, but after talking to some friends I realized C.S. Lewis beat me to it. And after doing some research, it seems J.P. Moreland also holds a similar view. So I guess I'm not as original as I thought, but anyway, it basically goes like this. You have Earth, which becomes tainted with sin before the existence of man by the fall of Satan. Biblically, Satan is ruler over the earth. So sin and suffering enter the world prior to mankind at that point. Then God separates out a place called the Garden of Eden, where mankind lives, and God's sustaining presence prevents things like suffering, death, earthquakes, etc. Now after the sin of mankind, God removes his sustaining power and allows the effects of sin to expose mankind to suffering, death, and depreciation. But either way you look at it, God creates a world without animal suffering, Eden, and will create another one, heaven. Now, earth, in this view, is merely the place where you use your free will to decide whether or not to accept or reject God. And I'll be looking at some reasons why animal suffering is conducive to producing a world where people choose to love God. I see absolutely no reason to think that God is not justified in allowing animal suffering. Now, the most common argument presented against Christianity at this point would be that God should have created earth in such a way that it was void of animal suffering. However, I see no reason to think that this would present a better world, especially if the purpose of earth is to allow people the opportunity to choose heaven. After all, animal sacrifices were required for the atonement of sin prior to Jesus' sacrifice, so animal death was actually necessary for the greater good of humanity. Now, for those who would argue that the world would be better if it was void of animal suffering, I would like to ask, how do you know? Again, this is kind of like someone being ignorant of science arguing that gravity should be a couple pounds less so it would be easier on our joints. If it would be like an argument from ignorance, because we simply don't know the effects of doing something like that. So in all actuality, if you did reduce gravity by a couple pounds, it would likely have catastrophic consequences for life on Earth and do absolutely nothing to alleviate joint pain. But anyway, back to the point. As I see it, there are two possible and plausible scenarios for a world created by God which has creatures and sin in it. The world could either be a place that contains animal suffering, or it could be a place where God intervenes and prevents animal suffering. Now, the latter possibility would be what some have called massively irregular, because God would constantly be enacting some sort of divine intervention on behalf of the animals. And I don't think there are sufficient reasons to conclude that the massively irregular world which contains sin would be superior to a world which contains creature suffering.
Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam alike, they can all repeat this truism that the finite cannot be expected to comprehend the infinite.
Now, you seem to have broadened my ninth argument against the evidential problem of evil into the statement, the finite cannot comprehend the infinite. Now, I don't think this rewording really does my argument justice. It makes it much more ambiguous and definitely takes away from its intended meaning, although I do think you meant well in trying to simplify it. But what I was originally trying to argue is that to assess the morality of an action, you must take into account the circumstances and intentions, and we're not in a position to know those circumstances. Now, to expand on that idea a bit, an action is right or wrong given its circumstances. For example, killing for self-defense is much different from killing for fun, from a moral perspective at least. Now, you can't claim things like anger is wrong because anger could be justified in certain situations or certain circumstances. Now, when looking at animal death in the world, in what position are we to call it evil? It would be the equivalent of making that blanket statement, anger is wrong, to say something like animal predation in the circle of life is evil. Now, therefore, I think it's quite obvious that if you don't know the circumstances and intentions of God, then it would be silly to conclude that his actions are immoral. You would need to provide some sort of reason that shows that God allows animal suffering because he desires to be cruel and not for some more noble purpose. Now, Todd spends his 3 videos addressing this one argument of mine, as he claims it is my main argument, but is by no means my only argument. I actually have 8 others geared towards the evidential problem of evil. I argue that you cannot know that suffering makes God, the Christian God, improbable, and then I present 8 additional arguments to show that suffering and the Christian God are actually both possible and likely to coexist. The 9th argument alone was never meant to be a single-handed refutation of the evidential problem of evil. All right, back to him.
But when the same argument can be used to support every religious claim about the supernatural world, even the most wildly contradictory claims, I find that the argument really supports nothing.
Now, if your argument can be so easily refuted that it fails to refute even the most ridiculous claims, I think it's the skeptic's job to come up with a better argument, not the theist's job to come up with a better rebuttal.
Now, I know that you believe that Christianity deserves to be the exception, but I hope you can see why those of us who lack belief in any one religion will find this argument just utterly unconvincing.
No, I don't. I really don't. I don't care whether you're a Christian trying to promote the concept of God, or a Hindu trying to promote the caste system, or a Muslim arguing for virgins in heaven. I am not asking that you base your conclusion off the idea that the finite cannot comprehend the infinite. That alone is insufficient information to make a conclusion either way. Now, what you do is you take the evidence at hand and you make a determination based off that evidence. So now I'm arguing that given the evidence at hand, there is no good reason to say that the Christian God, or the existence of the Christian God, is improbable, and there is good reason to think that the Christian God does exist. I hope we would use that same standard of justification for any belief we hold.
Finite cannot comprehend the infinite. Don't question the will of the gods.
You keep comparing my religion to other viewpoints, but the comparison is not an accurate one. I do not hold that we should not question, and my religion doesn't advocate that position either. In fact, it teaches quite the opposite. So in conclusion, there is not sufficient reason to think that God allows animal suffering out of malice or to be cruel, and therefore it is illogical to conclude that God's existence is improbable on account of animal suffering in the world. So remember, God loves you, and so do I.